Good morning. The open meeting for Thursday, July 25th, 2019 of the Federal Election Commission will now come to order. I believe we have a motion for some late submitted documents. Mr. Vice Chairman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move to suspend the rules on the timely submission of agenda documents in order that the Commission may consider the late submission of agenda documents numbered 19-31-A1 and 19-36A.
Vice Chairman has moved that we suspend the rules on the timely submission of agenda documents in order that the Commission may consider the late submission of agenda documents 19-31-A1 and 19-36-A. Any discussion on the motion? If not, I'll call the question. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
The motion passes unanimously. I'm going to rejigger the schedule a little bit since we have some AOs and we have requesters. We'll take up the item 1 on the agenda at the end so as not to delay the requesters' counsels who are waiting. And there is also a change to the agenda. Item 5, Draft Advisory Opinion 2019-14 is going to be held over till the next meeting. The requester has granted an extension, and I think there may be some further factual development that will assist us in giving the requester the best possible answer. So we will take that one up at the next meeting in August. So the next item on the agenda is Draft Advisory Opinion 2019-10 from Price for Congress. Mr. Passantino, if you'd like to come to the table in case anybody has any questions for you. Pleasure to have you. Mr. Paulson.
Thank you, Chair Weintraub, and good morning, Commissioners. Before you is Agenda Document 19-33-A, a draft advisory opinion responding to a request from Price for Congress, the Principal Campaign Committee of retired Representative Dr. Thomas Price, which asks whether it may contribute committee assets to a nonprofit organization and whether that organization may engage in certain activities if Dr. Price will serve as its president and CEO. First, the draft concludes that the recipient organization qualifies as an entity described in Section 170C of the Internal Revenue Code, because the requester has represented that the organization will operate as a nonprofit entity for an educational purpose and that it will not attempt to influence legislation or intervene in any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for public office. Because the Act and Commission regulations permit the donation of campaign funds to organizations described in Section 170C of the Internal Revenue Code, and because no committee funds will be converted to personal use by Dr. Price or any other person, the draft concludes that the committee may donate its funds to the organization as proposed. We did not receive any comments on the request or on the draft. Thank you, and I'm happy to address any questions that you have.
Well, I'm going to ask you a question, Mr. Paulson, because I think that's what you said is not actually right. 170C is limited to charitable organizations that accept charitable contributions, groups that are qualified under 501c3 of the tax code. And I believe that this is an organization under 501c4.
So this is an issue we looked into, actually, and while 170C of the Internal Revenue Code and 501c3 have some overlapping qualifications, 170C actually does not reference explicitly 501c3. The only reference to 501c3 in Section 170C is one prong of the 170C2 criteria, which states that an organization cannot be disqualified for tax exemption under 501c3 by reason of attempting to influence legislation or participating or intervening in political campaigns, which this organization has represented it will not be doing. And we have noted in 2 prior advisory opinions, one that Section 170C2 and 501c3 have overlapping qualifications but are not synonymous. And in another prior advisory opinion, we noted in a footnote that other 501c organizations that are not 501c3 are not necessarily disqualified from qualifying as a 170C organization.
Do you have any authority from the IRS on that?
We do not, and we have explicitly said in the draft that this is for purposes of our regulations. So we have been careful to not opine on the IRS's interpretation of the tax code.
Because I got to tell you, based on my experience in private practice, I think that would come as a big surprise to a lot of practitioners to discover that 501c4s are qualified under Section 170C. That is not my understanding of the general understanding of the law and how people understand 170C. And for that reason, I don't think that I'm going to be able to support this advisory opinion because I think it is an expansion of what we've said before about the personal use exemptions. It would expand it to 501c4 organizations, which I don't think the commission has ever done before, and I'm just not comfortable doing that. Commissioner Hunter?
Thank you, Mr. Paulson. That was an excellent answer, and I agree with you. The section of the law that we're considering here is 30114A, and it specifically states that permitted uses include for contributions to an organization described in Section 170C of the Internal Revenue Code of 1986. Certainly, Congress would have written 501c3 organizations if that's exactly the only thing that they was permitted to be used. So our law in particular only says 170, and we've just discussed why 501c4 in this context is perfectly permissible, not only under our regs, under our E&J, under the law, and under our prior AO precedents. It stands squarely within the same construct as several advisory opinions that we've approved in the past, including one quite recently for former Congressman Tom Lantos in the recent past. So I don't see any distinction under the law in this case and any difference regarding whether or not they choose to be a C3 or a C4, which we discussed last night. And I still, I spent a lot of time last night thinking about that, and there's no legal distinction here. You might not like the idea for reasons that I don't understand of allowing 501c4s to do this sort of thing, but there's no legal restriction that I can see to say no to this organization.
Well, as I indicated, Commissioner, I'm just going to have to respectfully disagree with you on that because, as I said, based on my experience in practice, 170C is not generally considered to cover 501c4 organizations. The AO that you refer to, I suppose you could say it was for former Congressman Lantos. It was actually about deceased Congressman Lantos's campaign fund. So I don't think there were a lot of concerns in that case that he was going to be personally using the funds that were being transferred to a human rights organization in that case. Every other AO that the commission has issued that is relied upon in this draft involve 501c3 organizations or organizations that said that they were going to seek IRS approval as a 501c3. I don't think there's any examples of 501c4s in our history.
What specifically is, are you concerned with in the draft here of the facts that Mr. Price's committee is asserting here? What specifically are you concerned about? Because obviously we all want to make sure that there's no personal use with the campaign funds. Obviously that's against the law. And as we've discussed, it's specifically they're allowed to use the money for 170C, but there's also a catch-all. For any other lawful purpose, and this is 30114A6, for any other lawful purpose unless prohibited by subsection B of this section. So as long as it's not personal use, it's permitted under our law, even if you decide for reasons that I still don't fully understand that 501c4s are not okay, there's the catch-all. But what in particular about this request are you concerned about? What makes you think that there's going to be some personal benefit to Mr. Price? As we've discussed, we've laid out the different things that requester has said specifically that they won't do, including the things that were just articulated by Mr. Paulson.
I understand that you are displeased with my decision here, Commissioner, but this is based on my understanding of the law. If we were to approve this advisory opinion, it would extend the personal use exemption to 501c4 organizations in a way that the commission has not done before and that I'm not willing to do.
What specifically is he saying that he's going to do that makes you think that's personal use? Because that could be problematic for a lot of other people, even if they're operating under 501c4s, even if they're operating under their authorized campaign committee. I mean, there's all kinds of things that are going on, doing speeches and all kinds of other. We're going to have an AO request in a few minutes that talks about approving campaign funds for babysitting services for a candidate who was paying for those services while she wasn't a candidate. So I think we're going to say that's okay to do, but we're not going to say that it's okay apparently for Mr. Price to go out and talk about things and specifically say that he's not going to use the funds to benefit himself. He's not going to get paid. His family members are not going to get paid. He's going to give some speeches, but he's already said he's not going to do any of the things that this commission has been historically concerned about in the past. So what specifically is he saying he's going to do that you're concerned about?
I'm concerned about extending the personal use exemption to 501c4 organizations, which are generally more opaque and less restricted than 501c3 organizations. They do not have to be operated exclusively for charitable purposes the way that 501c3 organizations do.
So maybe Mr. Passantino can help us out here, but my understanding is this is all campaign funds that are all disclosed and within the limits. Is that correct?
That is correct. What we're talking about here is a disposition of excess campaign funds, and I think that there is no dispute whatsoever that if the intended plan was to put these funds in a 501c3 organization, that this request wouldn't even be required because it would be consistent with past activity. Where I think we are maybe looking in a different direction here is this body, the commission's job is to look at the permitted use of excess campaign funds. The Act and the regs make very clear, first of all, they do not explicitly state it has to be a 501c3. The thing that the Act and the regs look at is what is the intended future use of these funds? Are these intended future use going to be for personal use or not? Here, we're making it very, very clear that the intended future use is not going to be with respect to political activities, personal activities, or lobbying activities, the very things which I think, Madam Chair, you are concerned about. 170C, though, does permit an organization, the funds that are being set up here, a 501c4 organization, is perfectly permitted to do all of the things that we're talking about here, and are all the things that this act and these regulations, the only thing that this commission is concerned about, you're not granting us C3 status, you're not allowing us to take tax deductions. The only question is, are we going to be using these funds consistent with the act and the regulations? And we are holding out that it's entirely our intention to, and clearly if we didn't, then that would present a completely different situation. The only thing that this commission should be looking at, therefore, is as the staff, and we are in complete agreement with the staff's analysis of that, is that if our activity is consistent with the act and the regs, it qualifies as a permitted excess disposition of excess campaign funds. That's all we're intending to do. It should not be required that we go through all of the additional expense of creating a 501c3, which is a much more difficult entity and is not required by us here. We're intending to undertake all of the things that are required under the Act and the regulations. And so for that reason, that should be where the Commission's analysis ends, as long as we are acting consistent with what the Act and the regulations say, as we intend to do here. If Congress had intended for excess disposition of funds, or even if these regs had said it must be a 501c3 entity, it would have been very easy to so state. It explicitly expanded into conduct which we intend to undertake. To us, that's the only real issue that's being presented here. That's the only issue before the Commission. And we're not asking for any type of expansion beyond the existing regs. We're just looking for an application of the law as it stands now.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Passantino, I'm not a tax lawyer, but I have looked over the the tax code a little bit and some of the applicable regulations on this point. Let me first ask the question to you. Can a 501c4 organization, can a contribution to a 501c4 contribution under certain circumstances qualify for a charitable deduction?
No, a 501c4 organization, by definition, under the tax code, you cannot take a tax deduction for a contribution to a 501c4, as I understand it.
Okay. And however, a 501c4 and its activities can still function as a 501c3.
Yes.
And so, well, let me have you answer that question.
Oh, Mr. Vice Chair, that's precisely my point, and I think that you've articulated it very well. What we're looking at here is the use of the excess campaign funds. If the use of the excess campaign funds is consistent with what's permitted by 173, it is a permissible use of excess campaign funds. That is our goal, and you've explicitly identified the issue. The vehicle or the vessel into which it's placed is not the relevant analysis. If it were, it would be explicitly in the statute. It's the conduct to which those funds are being put to use that's relevant and which we intend to use explicitly consistent with the Act and the regulations.
That's the way I read Section 170C of Title 26 as well, that it's not the formal classification of the organization, it's the actual activities undertaken by that organization that determine whether or not it falls within 170C. And so for me, that's a pretty easy question. But even if we're going to assume for the sake of argument that, that a 501c4 doesn't qualify, and I think it does, that doesn't end the question. As Commissioner Hunter just pointed out, we still have the catch-all provision in 3114A6, which talks about any other lawful purpose. Now, let me ask counsel, are you aware of any authority that says that a donation of excess campaign funds to a C4 is an unlawful purpose?
I'm not aware of any.
Yeah, nor am I, and I'm not aware of anything that would indicate otherwise. And if it's a lawful purpose, then this is a purely personal use analysis. And now we have to look at how is this money being used? And the representations, and in the advisory opinion context, we take the representations on their face. We don't pretend to look behind and think that there might be some other thing going on, because if there is some other thing going on, then the protection of the AO would not extend to that. It only extends to the representations that a requester makes to the commission. And the way that the representation is that the activities are going to be consistent with what a 501c3, the activities that they undertake, that Mr. Price, nor his family, nor any former employees will be drawing any salary. They will be reimbursed for certain travel expenses or out-of-pocket expenses associated with travel, as I understand. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And it's not, and this isn't just a guise also for him to travel the world, that they're actually going to produce research and papers and speeches, and maybe you could speak to that issue a little bit about some of the product that this organization plans to disseminate.
Right. So this is a vehicle through which Dr. Price intends to continue a substantial amount of public policy analysis, not lobbying activity, but analysis of public policy, research speaking on various matters related to health policy, health budget issues, continue a lot of the policy work that he continued, that he was engaged in after leaving the Congress. And it is fully and is explicitly, as you've properly pointed out, one of the conditions of our advisory opinion request that the use of these funds is going to be devoted to those specific activities and not towards political activity, not towards independent expenditure, lots of things which a 501c4 organization or other types of organizations could do. We are explicitly going to be prohibited from doing all of those types of activities using these funds. It's explicitly, as we put in our advisory opinion request, going to be for policy research, analysis, presentation of papers, speeches, all on health policy and on budget issues.
So, in other words, the same limitations that were placed on former members who donated excess campaign funds to 501c3 organizations that we've dealt with in past advisory opinions are the same limitations that Mr. Price and his family and former employers would be, they would be operating under those same restrictions in this particular matter.
Yes, and we explicitly put in our advisory opinion request that we intend to follow past advisory opinions such as Lantos and others, which have already plowed this ground before, and we are not intending to do anything in any way inconsistent with past advice of the commission with respect to all of those restrictions on personal use. We agree with that and explicitly put it in our request.
But if,
Sure. Happy to
But-
defer.
I mean, really, the reference to the Lantos AO is not, Mr. Lantos was not going to be traveling at the expense of the Human Rights Organization, which was a 501c3, as a result of the advisory opinion that the commission granted him, since he was dead at the time the advisory opinion was granted. But Dr. Price, I assume, is anticipating that he will be traveling on behalf of this organization.
It's possible, but that is really, and I'm not even, that's explicitly permitted in other requests, which is expenses incurred in connection with the direct duties of the public policy activities of the organization. I visualize there might be opportunities where Dr. Price might be speaking and might be asked to go and speak with respect to a matter. There will be some incidental costs incurred in connection with that, for which we are talking about. I don't think the fact that Congressman Lantos was alive or not alive doesn't affect the very sort of clear body of law.
Whether he was going to be personally using the funds?
No, I think what's important here is that there's a long body of, and we've cited numerous advisory opinions, of which that's merely one of the most recent and most applicable examples of this commission having previously approved not as counting as a personal use, the reimbursement of out-of-pocket expenses incurred in connection with the activities of the tax-exempt entity. And there are numerous advisory opinions which we have cited which stand for that principle. And I don't think we're plowing new ground here at all.
All of the precedents that were cited in the draft AO pertain to 501c3s.
Right, I understand, and that's the key issue. But I think that once we get to the personal use issue, whether it's a 501c3, 501c4 is completely irrelevant for purposes of if an individual who is not receiving compensation, who's not paying their family, who is not in any way receiving remuneration out of those campaign funds, if they're receiving reimbursement for expenses, it doesn't matter what the entity is. This commission has held several times that is not an impermissible personal use of excess campaign funds. That's the only principle for which this entire sort of body of advisory opinions, which are longstanding, which are not controversial, and which we intend to fully follow. That's a separate issue from whether the entity out of which that discussion arose was a 501c3 or a 501c4 entity. They're two separate issues that we're talking about here.
Vice Chairman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I really do think that this distinction between a 501c3 and a 501c4 and whether or not we think that a 501c4 can still fit within the confines of an organization described in 170C of the Internal Revenue Code. Like I said, I think it fits within it, but even if we don't think it does, all we're determining is whether or not we need to invoke A3 of Section 114 or A6 of Section 114. The analysis still comes down to personal use and how is this money being used. And frankly, if it's impermissible for Mr. Price, and that it's impermissible personal use for him to use his campaign funds in the ways proposed in this request, then it's also impermissible for those who've made similar requests under the guise of 501c organizations. I think the C4, C3 distinction is, like I said, I think it's a red herring. Let me ask the chair, do you believe it's a lawful donation, that a campaign can make a donation to a C4? Is that a lawful purpose and a lawful disbursement of campaign funds?
That's not the draft that we have in front of us.
That is every bit relevant to this discussion that we're having.
No,
because
that's
if
not the draft. The draft that we have in front of us says that
You-
we're going to treat a 501c4 just like a 501c3 and assume that it is covered under 170C
Okay,
of
let's,
tax code.
how about we have an alternative draft and put together saying that, well, assuming for the sake of argument that it doesn't qualify under A3, that it's not, and we're not going to treat it like a 501c3, it's going to be purely an analysis of lawful, whether or not this is a lawful purpose to make a contribution, to use excessive campaign funds and give those to the organization. And then we're going to analyze whether or not that is a personal use. Is that a lawful disbursement?
It could be, but that's not what's in front of us right
I
now.
certainly hope it is, because you would be telling a lot of members of Congress that they've made illegal contributions who've given to the ACLU, which is a C4, which have given to the NAACP, which is a C4. So I think unless we're willing to say that dozens, maybe hundreds of members of Congress have made unlawful contributions to C4 organizations, the question then turns to, is this a personal use? And if you're saying that it is personal use under these circumstances, then you're saying, then there's no meaningful distinction between this and prior AOs, many of which, and most of which maybe that are cited, you voted for. So what about the actual use of the funds being proposed by Dr. Price constitutes personal use?
Just to correct you, I think most of the AOs that are cited were actually before my time. There are a number of old ones. There are a couple of more recent ones.
2005-06 McInnes.
Yes, which
you were here for
involved, I was here for that. And
You were
I
here for
voted
Lantos?
it, and I was here for Lantos, but as
I
I
was here for
said,
Lantos.
Lantos, there was really no issue that Lantos was going to be using the funds for personal use. I mean, it just was not realistic.
Last time I looked, I don't think that was a relevant factor in the analysis that we put in the language of that advisory opinion.
Well, if the bottom line issue is whether the member of Congress or the former member of Congress is going to be personally using the funds, the fact that he's dead is kind of relevant. And I'll have to go back and double check, but I don't think that any of the prior precedents involved organizations that were personal vehicles for the former member. I could be wrong about that. I have to go back and.
I'm going to turn to counsel. Can you give us some of the factual descriptions of the advisory opinions that were cited in your draft? I shouldn't say in the draft that has been made blue thus far.
Yes, if you give me a moment, I'll pull those out. So in the 1983 draft, or 1983 opinion, McDaniel, in that case, McDaniel was an unsuccessful candidate for U.S. House in 1982. I believe he had recently formed a 501c3 organization that was going to educate the public on defense issues. He was going to serve as chairman of the board of directors
Chairman of the board of the directors.
and would not be compensated for his services, but would be compensated for out-of-pocket expenditures. Lantos, we've discussed, in that case, Congressman Lantos was recently deceased. In the case of AO 2005-06 McInnes, former Representative McInnes wanted to donate campaign funds to a 501c3 conservation group. He did not serve on the board of directors. He did not have any financial interest or control over the organization in that case. 1997, AO 1997-01 Bevel. In that case, the requester, Mr. Bevel, was a former member of Congress. He donated to an organization that I don't have the purpose of the organization in front of me, but that was an organization that would be controlled by Mr. Bevel, his daughter, and his wife, who would serve as directors. Those were several of the opinions that we relied on.
It sounds like
We might also want to add 1996-40 Hancock, which I believe was also one which was explicitly created to permit the former candidate to serve as president and chairman of the board, which stands for the proposition that it was permitted so long as Hancock was prohibited from receiving a salary or director's fees. And I think that also a relevant point here is it's not necessarily just the individual, but this personal use exemption extends to family and former members. And so the fact whether the candidate, him or herself, is alive is not actually relevant to this analysis, because the prohibition on personal use extends to family who can survive the candidate, him or herself, as well.
So we have a pretty, a decent list indicating that in prior cases, whether they were chairman of the board of directors, whether they were president, whether they were board directors in the case of, I think, Bevel, they weren't just giving the money and then walking away. They were involved in a substantial way, and maybe perhaps even controlling the group itself. So I don't think that the role in which Mr. Price is looking to play in this proposed C4 is much different than we've seen in several prior advisory opinions. So I'm still unsure of why we should treat this circumstance any different when the use of the funds is going to be under the same restrictions that those prior AOs required.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman, and thank you, Council. And I appreciate that you have refreshed my recollection, and some of the older AOs, none of the ones that I voted for.
So you disagree with those?
And, well, I would have to think about whether I think it's an appropriate use of funds and whether there's a potential for personal use there, particularly in the context of a 501c4 and not a 501c3. All of those were 501c3s. I would be happy to consider that, but that is not the draft that's in front of us.
How is a C4?
Support the draft that's in front of us, which respectfully I think is wrong on the law.
I'm somewhat baffled. What is the difference between a C3 and a C4? And for purposes of a personal use analysis, we have the representations from council. We're acting as if somehow because they can engage, a C4 can theoretically engage in a broader array of activity, including lobbying and political intervention, that somehow affects the personal use analysis. I mean, I'm absolutely at a loss as to how that is relevant when we're making a personal use analysis under, 3114B, and I'm still not hearing an answer. I understand that there's a difference between the groups, and maybe that has a relevance to you in terms of whether or not it fits under A3 of 3114. We can agree to disagree on that, but there still is A6. There's a catch-all provision. It is a lawful purpose to give to a C4. And so now we're back looking purely as to whether or not that is a personal use of campaign funds. And whether it's a C3 or a C4, I completely at a loss as to how that's relevant in terms of the same activities performed and the same leadership responsibilities that a former member might perform for a C3, why that's fine, but would be impermissible with respect to a C4.
There are greater restrictions in the law on the activities that are acceptable for a C3 organization.
And that is relevant to personal use how?
I get it that you disagree with me, but
I don't know what to disagree with, because I'm not hearing a rationale as to why that's a distinction that means anything.
Because C4s can engage in a wider range of activity. They have been involved in any number of problematic situations under the campaign finance laws, in my experience, and I am not going to extend what the commission has previously said, and that's what this AO would do. It completely glosses over the difference between C3s and C4s. And I had read it a little bit differently. I thought what you were saying was that since they are going to act like a C3, we can treat them like a C3. But what I hear counsel saying at the table today is that they think that it is, in fact, covered by 170C. And I just do not believe that that is generally the view of the legal community, that 501c4 organizations are encompassed under the provisions of 170C. That's, maybe some tax lawyers will educate me on that point, but based on my experience in practice before I came to the commission, That was not my understanding of the law. And so this opinion is, I believe, based on an erroneous explanation of the law, so I can't support it for that reason alone, and would additionally extend what we have said previously about the scope of that particular provision of, I always think of it as 439A, under the old provision, the old codification, but I guess it's 30114, and the commission regulations. So,
Madam Chair, if I may just be heard simply because we're talking about my representations here, I'd just like to clarify for the record. What we're saying is that we intend to conduct activity consistent with 170C as the statute requires. There's no dispute that a 501c4 entity is entitled to do all of those things. We're not saying that a 501c4 organization is going to take a tax deduction or anything. The only issue here is, do we intend to use our funds in a way that's consistent with the statute and with the regulations? We do intend to do that, and a 501c4 has every ability to do that a 501c3 does. If Congress had intended to limit this analysis to 501c3, it could have. It didn't. We are stuck. We cannot rewrite what the statute says. What the statute says is if we intend to conduct our behavior consistent with the law and not engage in personal use, that it is permissible. And that's all that we're asking, and that's all that we intend to do.
if I vote for this AO, every 501c4 organization out there is going, or anyone who wants to establish a 501c4 organization is going to claim protection under this AO.
Madam Chair, I mean, we've tried this many different times, but let me try one more time. Mr. Pasentino has said, and we've all repeated, that in the request, they've said that the organization will serve an educational purpose related to health, budget, and other public policy matters. This is on page 5 of the draft. And it will not attempt to influence legislation nor participate or intervene in any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for public office, consistent with the limitations set forth in section 170C. Mr. Pasentino said that numerous times this morning. That's directly in the representations from council and also in the draft before us today. What specifically are you concerned that Mr. Price may do that may constitute personal use? Because he's already carved out what I think you're saying is that the type of things that you worry about C4s can do, which is the political stuff. He's already saying he's not going to do that. So what specifically are you concerned about?
I am specifically concerned that we would be broadening the scope of the exemption to the personal use exemption to organizations under 501c4.
But we're not doing that.
Well, yes, we are.
No, we're not, because
they're
we're
a
specifically
501c4.
saying, they're 501c4s, but we're specifically saying that this advisory opinion, as we've discussed numerous times over the years, it will only be, other people will only be able to rely on it if the facts are materially indistinguishable, or you know what I'm saying, something along those lines.
do.
Yes, and so if a 501c4 comes along and says, we're going to participate in political campaign activity, et cetera, then they can't rely on this opinion. Then they'd probably be okay under A6, the catch-all, but putting that aside for a minute, it's not opening it up to all 501c4s, only those that make these same representations. And again, I'm willing to go a lot further and say as long as it's for any other lawful purpose, it's fine. But what specifically in this request are you concerned about that Mr. Price may do?
Asked and answered, Commissioner.
I actually didn't ever answer it. You never answered it.
That's what you say, and yet you asked a question.
All right, say it
and I
again.
said
If I didn't hear you, I apologize. Go ahead and say it again.
I'm not going to vote for this, okay?
So there's no reason. Okay.
I am not going to vote for this. I view it as an extension of the exemption under the personal use restrictions, and I am not about that. So
You're not about that. Okay. One of the things you said is completely arbitrary and capricious in my opinion. What you said earlier was that 501c4s are generally more opaque. I don't know what you mean by that, because while C4s don't disclose their donors, neither do C3s. I don't know how C4s are more opaque than C3s. Maybe I'm missing something. Can you?
No, you're right. C4s are more opaque in the political context where they engage in political activity. They are more opaque than political committees.
Okay. So you want to maybe you should write a rule that says,
I wouldn't vote for it.
no, I wouldn't vote for it.
So
but,
why bother?
That you just don't like C4s because they might engage in political activity. I mean, that's apparently what this is all about. It just gives you an unsettling feeling. It's just not appropriate. You're not really sure why, but you don't like C4s. And so you're going to read out any possibility for people to engage in the kind of activity that's protected. And I don't there's no legal rationale for not agreeing to
No,
this.
we just read the law differently.
Yes, we do often read the law differently, but in this case, I'm not even hearing a reason for your reading of the law. And Peterson and I have tried numerous times. There is not apparently a reason. But Mr. Pasatino, I understand why you submitted this request. And you're trying, I mean, as a well-known ethics lawyer, you want to be very careful, and it makes a lot of sense. But I'm not sure that you really need it. And I don't know, we could take another run at a draft that, I know Peterson already asked you this, but a draft that says it's okay under the personal use provision.
Instead of going through A3, going through A6.
Yes.
Saying any other lawful purpose.
Yes, would that be something that I don't want to waste anybody's time, but would that be something you might be interested in voting for if we asked the council to take a crack at that kind of draft?
I would consider it, but I'm not going to make any commitments in advance.
And Commissioner, I would cooperate in that process because while I agree, we're sitting here, I believe, and I don't want to speak for anyone, I think I see the disconnect here in that there is a concern that the chair has with respect to various permitted activities by 501c4 entities such as independent expenditures, various influence type activities for which there is not the same disclosure that a political committee has. And that if, in fact, there were to be an expansion of the rule that would allow candidates to go into committees that were, or funds that would do those things, that would be something where the chair sees as problematic. That's not the impact of what we're seeking here, because we are specifically exempting all of those types of activities that the chair is most concerned about with respect to the activities of 501c4s. That said, because of the profile of my client and with respect to sort of just the outside ground noise that comes with respect to anything that anyone does who's been associated with the current administration, I have to do this. I can't just say I'll see you in court because that's going to cost my client a whole lot more money. I believe that there would be absolutely no concern by this commission if we were to set up a 501c3 and did all of the things. Let's pick one. Crew is a 501c3. There's no dispute that I could set up an organization and do everything that Crew does. That's not what we're seeking to do. We're seeking to not go through the 501c3 process, but engage in those same activities. But I will work with the commission. I'm in full agreement with you that the lawful purpose test is the beginning and the end of all of this. We did everything we could to craft this opinion to make it clear we're fitting squarely within existing precedent on that ground. But I need to I intend to work with you to get some approved mechanism to allow us to engage in this very clear conduct that lots of folks engage in and that is in the public interest to engage in. So I will work with you and the commission if we need to rework to take out the 170C analysis and leave this to lawful use. We'll work with you on that.
Okay. Thank you. What is the deadline on this advisory opinion request, Mr. Paulson?
It's August 5th.
Okay. So what would be the best way to proceed from a logistic standpoint?
I think the best way to proceed at this point would be to request an extension from the requester to at least get us through the next meeting. If we want to look at an alternative draft that goes through the analysis that we've all discussed today.
Yeah, and we would consent to that.
Okay. I mean, because we've had such a robust public
Robust.
discussion.
That's exactly the word I was gonna
That's a good word to describe it. It's possible that we may be able to do this on tally vote. We may not. I'm just putting that out there as a possibility if people are comfortable. There is a little bit of a gap between this meeting and the next open meeting, but if we need to have another public discussion, I'm sure we're all willing to do so. And one last thing, I think you said this in your opening. This draft went public on July 17th. So what's that, about a week ago?
That's correct.
And I think you said we did not receive any public comments?
That's also correct.
Okay. I find that telling. You know, a lot of people read our drafts, and it was out there this time for a good amount of time, and we did not receive any comments on it.
People were commenting on the internet.
On the internet?
Yeah.
When were they commenting on the internet?
There was a little bit of chatter on this AO and on Twitter.
Oh, there was?
Yeah.
Oh, well, since I'm not on Twitter, fill us in.
Said the draft got the law wrong.
Who said that?
I'd have to go back and look at the individual. It was some kind of a back and forth. It was not Rick Hassan, but I think it was a back and forth that tagged him.
Somebody, are you aware of who the chair's talking about?
I'm sorry, I don't remember the name.
I think that there was some discussion on Rick Hassan's blog, a very short post that I saw, but I didn't follow all of it either.
What was the reasoning that the person said that the draft got it wrong?
There was a discussion, I believe, and I'm not sure if we're talking about the same tweets, but I believe there was a discussion of 170C, whether it applied to 501c3s or 501c4s, and I believe the Rick Hassan update, I think he updated his post to say, I believe the draft is relying on representations about operating as a 501c3. But I'd have to look at it again, but I know there was back and forth. I saw that as well.
Mr. Vice Chairman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Commissioner Hunter, I don't know if you made this explicit request, but I think that she was intimating, in the event that you didn't actually make the explicit request, if we could ask counsel to prepare an appropriate draft that analyzes this question through the lens of Section 3114A6 under any lawful purpose, and so that we don't get caught in the whether or not a C4 can fit within the confines of 170C as a potential compromise. If you could prepare an appropriate draft that we could then review and see if we can't find some sort of consensus on that.
Thank you. I'd also like to keep this draft on the public record, and I, will work with my colleagues, and maybe we can garner 4 votes for this one, because I think it is 100% on all fours with the law, the regs, and the precedent. And again, maybe we can convince people. I'll go back and I guess read Twitter, because I didn't know that was part of the public record, but take a look at that kind of stuff and use the one that you're going to prepare as an alternate draft. Maybe we can agree on this one after all.
I would not, based on this robust discussion, I'm not sure why you would think that this draft is going to end up getting 4 votes, but I'm happy to consider alternatives.
Well, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but because I still haven't heard a reason for the difference between C3s and C4s, and I still haven't heard what specifically in the request you're concerned about that would mean that it's not permissible. Both of us asked you numerous times, and maybe you'll have a chance to think about it. We've had a lot going on in executive sessions the past couple of weeks, and we've been really trying to get some things off the docket. So maybe people will have more time to focus on this issue.
Thank you.
So as I understand it, there is not a desire to take a vote on this today. And I believe we will take this up again on paper or perhaps at the next meeting based on council's granting of an extension. So the story goes on. Thank you, Mr. Paulson. Thank you, Mr. Passantino. Next item on the agenda is Draft Advisory Opinion 2019-11, Pro-Life Democratic Candidate PAC. Do we have counsel? Mr. Lupfer?
Yes, Jacob Lupfer, and I'm not an election lawyer. I'm just a humble political consultant
That's fine.
seeking clarity from this body on the matter presented. So,
You are welcome, sir.
Wait, you don't want to talk about the previous matter?
oh, I'm too much on Twitter.
Ms. Philmeyer?
Thank you, Chair Weintraub, and good morning, Commissioners. Before you is Agenda Document 19-35-A, a draft advisory opinion responding to a request from the Pro-Life Democratic Candidate PAC, which is a non-connected political committee. The requester asks whether it may accept and forward contributions earmarked for a yet unnamed Democratic presidential candidate who meets certain specified endorsement and experience criteria without itself making a contribution to the recipient of funds. The committee further asks whether it may designate a specific congressional candidate committee as the default recipient in the event that no presidential candidate meets the criteria, or whether it must instead offer refunds if that occurs. The draft concludes that all contributions to the draft fund would be attributable only to the original contributors and not to the committee, because the committee exercises no direction or control over the choice of the recipient of funds given the objective, easily determinable criteria specified. The draft further concludes that it is permissible for the committee to designate a specific congressional candidate committee to serve as the default recipient instead of offering refunds if no presidential candidate meets the criteria to receive the earmarked contributions, because it is lawful for a conduit to forward contributions to a default recipient that the conduit identifies to contributors at the time the contribution is made. We received one comment on the request. We did not receive any comments on the draft. Thank you, and I'd be happy to address any questions you may have.
Thank you. Do we have any questions for counsel or Mr. Lupfer or discussion? Anybody got anything?
I think our tanks may be on empty. The fuel light may be on, and
Maybe. I intend to support the draft. I think it is consistent with prior advisory opinions, particularly with, I think it was advisory opinion 2019-1?
Yes,
Yes.
it starts today.
Yes. Very, very similar advisory opinion. I think you've got two objective criteria, endorsement and qualifications. And the qualifications are fairly ascertainable facts. So I intend to support the draft. Mr. Vice Chairman.
thank you, Madam Chair. I agree. I think that this is on all fours with past advisory opinions we've issued, and I don't have any concerns with it. I don't know if there was anything that you wanted to speak to, since you made the trip in, if there were any comments that you wanted to make about the draft, or...
No, I just thought that not just on behalf of this client of mine, but just in general, since the nature of the draft fund seems to me, so often it's just, draft veto, right? So the draft is thinking of one particular person. And even in the Act Blue opinion from some years ago that was cited, it was a woman for president draft fund. But the woman for president was if the 2016 nominee should be a woman. So there was only one person who that was going to be. And so in this case, since I thought that since it introduces some kind of different sets of criteria, that if in the future others had the intent to do a draft fund that was this kind of creative or innovative, that they also might benefit from the clarity of an advisory opinion. So that was part of the rationale. So thank you.
Sure.
Any other discussion? If not, I'll entertain a motion.
I'll be happy to make a motion if
Mr. Vice Chairman.
time is right. All right, thank you, Madam Chair. In our consideration of draft advisory opinion 2019-11, submitted by Pro-Life Democratic Candidate PAC, represented here by Mr. Jacob Lupfer, I move approval of agenda document number 19-35-A.
Thank you. The Vice Chairman has moved approval of Agenda Document 19-35-A, a proposed answer to Pro-Life Democratic Candidate PAC, and should it be approved, it would become Advisory Opinion 2019-11. Is there any discussion on the motion? If not, I will call the question. All in favor, say aye.
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 The motion carries unanimously. Congratulations.
Bring unanimity to the commission. Congratulations.
Thank you,
It does
Commissioners.
happen. It does happen. And who knows, maybe we'll be on a little bit of a roll. The next item on the agenda is Draft Advisory Opinion 2019-13, Mary Jennings Hager and MJ for Texas. Oh, we have counsel with us. Welcome. It's always nice to see you.
Morning, Commissioners.
Good morning. Mr. Knopp, are you presenting this morning?
Indeed. Thank you, Madam Chair, and good morning, Commissioners. Before you is a draft advisory opinion responding to a request from Senate candidate MJ Hagar and her campaign committee. The request asks whether the committee may use campaign funds to pay for child care expenses for the candidate's young children during her campaign. The draft concludes that the committee may pay for child care expenses that are the direct result of campaign activity and therefore would not exist irrespective of the candidate's campaign. The commission received one comment on the request and no comments on the draft. Thank you.
Thank you. I particularly like this advisory opinion. It is rare that we get an advisory opinion where the candidate's opponent submits a comment supporting the candidate's request. So, we're bringing Texas together on this advisory opinion. And I think it is completely consistent with particularly with the recent opinion that we granted to Luba for Congress in 2018-06, because it's going to be limited to the child care expenses that are a direct result of campaign activity. So I appreciate the request. I think it will, requests like this will help to enable a wider diversity of candidates to consider running for office, more women, more people of limited income, and those are all good policy goals. But as I said, it is consistent with our prior precedents. I plan to support it.
Were there any comments on Twitter on this one?
I didn't notice.
Oh, okay.
Do you have any comments, Commissioner?
I do, but I probably, let me think about whether or not I'm going to say it. Not right now.
Okay. Anybody else have any comments? If not, I will entertain a motion. Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Under consideration of Draft Advisory Opinion 2019-13, Mary Jennings Hager and MJ for Texas, I move approval of agenda document number 19-31-A1, which is being referred to as revised draft A.
Thank you. The Vice Chairman has moved approval of agenda document number 19-31-A1, which is a slight revision of the original draft A, and should it be adopted, it will become Advisory Opinion 2019-13 to Mary Jennings Hager and MJ for Texas. Is there any, do you want to say anything? Since you're here, counsel, we have two lawyers here. You're welcome to speak if you want to.
No, we fully support the draft. We think it's absolutely right, and we appreciate the commission approving it as written. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other discussion? If not, I will call the question. All in favor, say aye.
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 And the motion passes unanimously.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Commissioners.
Thank you, counsel, and thank you, counsel. Okay, so the next item was the Arizona Libertarian Party, but as I said at the outset, we're going to hold that one for the next meeting. And that brings us to a notification of availability for Regulation 2019-01. Mr. Buckley.
Thank you, Chair Weintraub. Good morning, Commissioners. Agenda document 19-36-A contains a draft notification of availability for a petition for rulemaking submitted to the Commission by Fiat Fiendum Incorporated, Make Your Laws PAC Incorporated, and Make Your Laws Advocacy Incorporated. The petition asks the Commission to amend 11 CFR Part 100, Subpart B, by adding a new Section 100.57 to clarify that the definition of contribution includes certain valuable information. The notification seeks comment on whether the Commission should commence a rulemaking based on this petition. The comment period will run for 60 days following publication of the notification in the Federal Register. After the comment period has concluded and after comments have been considered, the Commission may decide whether to initiate a rulemaking. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Buckley. Do we have any comments or questions? It's an interesting petition. We may well get some interesting comments. If there's no discussion, I'll entertain a motion. Mr. Vice Chairman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move that in our consideration of the notice of availability for Reg 2019-01, which would be adding valuable information to the definition of contribution, that we approve agenda document number 19-36-A.
Thank you. The Vice Chairman has moved approval of agenda document number 19-36-A, a notice of availability for Regulation 2019-01, adding valuable information to the definition of contribution. Any discussion on the motion? If not, I will call the question. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. And the motion passes unanimously. Good job. Thank you, Mr. Buckley. The next item on the agenda is the Audit Division Recommendation Memorandum on the Ambulatory Surgery Center Association PAC, ASCA PAC. I like the sound of that. A17-08.
Good morning, Chair. And staff is coming up here. They had a question that came up at the, prior to the meeting that they were reviewing. But I can go ahead and give the intro until
Oh, okay. Thank you, Ms. Orrock.
Absolutely. Good morning, Commissioners. Before you is the Audit Division Recommendation Memorandum on ASCA-PAC, the Ambulatory Surgery Center Association PAC. There are 5 findings outlined in this report. Finding 1 is misstatement of financial activity. Finding 2 is receipt of prohibited contributions. Finding 3 is record keeping for receipts. Finding 4 is disclosure of receipts. Finding 5 is untimely deposit of receipts. And as always, we're available to answer any questions that you may have. And additionally, we're just waiting for one other individual who was researching something, and she'll be here momentarily. But if we have questions, we certainly can entertain those as of this point.
Are there any questions? Mr. Vice Chairman.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. So my staff has been in contact with members of the audit staff about it's finding 2. And it was mainly just a little bit of clarification I needed. This is the finding regarding receipt of prohibited contributions. And on page 11, under the heading of contributions categorized as permissible, I was having a little bit of a difficult time just following. There's a lot of numbers being floated around, and I wasn't sure which numbers fit into which categories, because at the very beginning it talks about ASCA-PAC, stating that contributions totaling 43,121 were permissible, and then it breaks that down into, I guess, 37,000 and change, 5,500. And then we have another paragraph where we break down the numbers further, and I was just having a little bit of difficulty following.
Absolutely. And I would just want to highlight as well, sir, that on page 11 that you're referring to, that's the actual draft final audit report, which was actually submitted to ASCA-PAC on April 15th, 2019.
Okay.
So it's in the memo itself that we break down some of those items that you had questions about.
And could I just ask a point of clarification? It was my understanding that some of the, usually when we adopt an Audit Division Recommendation Memorandum and there's a draft final audit report attached to it, that becomes the proposed final audit report and ultimately the final audit report in our cumbersome process. But it's my understanding that there was further information that was provided by the committee after the drafting of this report. So I think some of the numbers are going to change by the time we get to the final.
That's what's outlined in the actual ADRM as per Directive 70. So that's outlined in pages 1 through 4 as per our process. Correct.
So maybe I could ask,
Ms. Rominski?
yes, if you could kind of walk us through the numbers that pertain to the finding number 2
Absolutely.
and just to make sure that we're, all clear on, I just want to make sure that I understand the numbers as presented by the committee that's being audited, what the auditor's determinations were with respect to those amounts, just to make sure that I'm crystal clear before voting on this.
Okay, so on page 11, section D, that first number for the contributions categorized as permissible, the $43,121, that was the amount that the committee stated in their narrative that was permissible. And then they further broke that down to $37,621 from eligible, what they called eligible LLCs with a corporate partner, and which they stated correctly is allowable as long as no part of the contribution is attributed to the corporation. And then the other $5,500 were received from LLC partnerships that had no corporate partner. When audit then looked at the documentation provided, there was only $26,649 documented in that category. The committee actually submitted a PDF titled Eligible Corporate Contributions. So of that $26,649, $16,074 were from LLCs that were owned by another LLC and or a corporate partner. And we had no documentation submitted showing the tax status of the LLC partners or any documentation that showed that the contribution was not in any part made by the corporate partner. And then 500 of that was from one LLP that was owned by two corporate partners. It's entirely from corporate entities and therefore impermissible. $1,500 was from an LLC that elected to be taxed as a partnership with the IRS, but since the documentation provided stated that the partners didn't know that the contribution had been made in their name, that stays impermissible. And then the remaining $8,575, the audit staff found that that was indeed permissible.
So with respect to the $16,074 number, those potentially could have been permissible, but there was no information provided indicating that the allocation as between the partners was in such a way that none of the corporate partners were making a contribution.
Correct.
So they could have potentially been permissible, but they just didn't give you the information in order to allow you to make that conclusion.
That's correct.
Okay. All right. Madam Chair, with that clarification, and thank you again for, I know that you've been speaking with my staff offline in an effort to try to get to the bottom of this as well, and certainly appreciate all your efforts and the helpfulness that you've provided. So I think that satisfies my questions. Happy to make a motion at the appropriate time.
Okay. Anybody else have any questions, comments, concerns? I had already voted in favor of this, so my concerns have been addressed. I think it sounds like we are indeed ready for a motion. Mr. Vice Chair.
All right, thank you, Madam Chair. In our consideration of Audit Division Recommendation Memorandum on the Ambulatory Surgery Center Association PAC, which we've been referring to as ASCA PAC, which is A17-08, I move approval of Agenda Document Number 19-34-A.
The Vice Chairman has moved approval of Audit Division Recommendation Memorandum on the Ambulatory Surgery Center Association PAC, ASCA PAC, A17-08, as set forth in Agenda Document Number 19-34A. Is there any discussion on the motion? If not, I will call the question. All in favor, say aye.
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 And the motion carries unanimously. Thank you. Well, that leaves us back at the beginning with the Internet Ad Disclaimers Rulemaking Proposal for Reg 2011-02, Internet Communication Disclaimers and Definition of Public Communications. It's Reg 2011-02 because we actually started this in 2011. It sort of languished until 2017, and then I tried to jumpstart it again. We had hearings about a year ago, or more than a year ago. We've had hundreds of thousands of comments asking us to do this rulemaking. I think it is an opportunity to provide both flexibility and clarity in an increasingly important aspect of political activity. There was a 260% increase in digital ads from the 2014 midterms to the 2018 midterm elections. Spending on digital ads is in the roughly $1 billion range for digital political ads. And more activity is moving online from traditional forms of advertising. And I think this is something that we really should address. We've had small group meetings, we've had regs committee meetings, I've had it on the agenda 3 times now. And the vice chairman keeps telling me that he sees a path forward. Mr. Vice Chairman, do you have the path for us today?
I can't say that I have the path forward. I know that my staff spoke with your staff, I think at length last night, to go through some of the issues that have been question marks. I think, not to say this is an exhaustive list, but one of the issues had been a provision that deals with the transferability of disclaimers. And I think we had earlier raised questions about, let's say that there's a Facebook post and that somehow gets screenshot and put on Twitter. How does that transferability work? And I think that there's been a proposal made that makes that provides useful clarification that's talking about transferability within the platform itself. So I thought that was helpful. There still are some, I think, outstanding issues on how the trigger would work. I think the new proposal language, I think, addresses some of the concerns we had. I don't know if we're completely comfortable, but I think it's in a better and I think we have a better understanding of the concerns animating the reason why you had the language the way you did in the prior version. The trigger will need to have some further discussion. I think also in terms of what's going to be considered an adequate truncation for ads that that qualify for an adapted disclaimer. I think we're going to need to have a little more meeting of the minds, because when is a group, I think we're going to have some guidance. We're not going to be able to, we wouldn't be able to have perfect guidance, but we would need to have some guidance about what would be considered adequate. If a group just put its acronym on, ABC Corp, would that be adequate? How do we evaluate when is an acronym sufficiently well known that, obviously, we in the political world, when we're talking about RNC, DNC, we know what that is. There are certain.
I think RNC is now the official name.
That's right.
Which they did in part because it really fits easily on disclaimers.
Right. That was a useful piece of information that they imparted to us at our hearing. I think that issue we'll need to tease out to make sure that that we're all on the same page. It wouldn't be helpful if we passed a rule and some of us thought that putting the acronyms of an organization were adequate, and others thought that no, if you want to make national NAT''L, that's fine, but you can't just put an N and make that stand in for national. I think that it's going to be a difficult thing to provide more guidance. It obviously wouldn't be able to be comprehensive because the universe of potential names of organizations would be so large that providing adequate, what would be considered an adequate truncated name would be impossible. But I think providing a little bit more clarity on that is going to be necessary. That one thing that I do want to, I would want in any final rule is that we get as much of the guidance in the rule itself, rather than relying on the E&J to flesh out things for practitioners inside the Beltway who know to look to the E&J. That's one thing, but for the vast majority of people who think that I should be able to go to the rule book and know whether or not I can or can't do a certain thing, I think that we want to make sure as much of the guidance is included in the draft rule as possible. So those are a few of the issues that I still think need to get worked through. Like I said, I think it was a good discussion between my staff and yours last night by phone. So I think there's definitely been some improvement in the process. There's just a few hurdles that I think we still need to overcome. And I don't want to underestimate that those might be significant, but I'm hopeful.
Well, on the specific point that you mentioned, the drafts, I think for a long time, I'm just looking at the last blue document that I made public, uses the phrase full name or a clearly recognized abbreviation or acronym by which the person or persons are commonly known. I don't know if, I guess I thought we could flesh that out in the E&J if you, I'm not sure how much more we could put in rule text on that specific point. I mean, my greater concern is just whether there's a real commitment to get this done, given that every single time it comes up, nothing happens until the day before the meeting. And we have, as you know, been trying to propose new language to address your ongoing concerns. It is difficult to get feedback. And if we are already, when I started this, my hope was to get a rule in place for the 2018 election. At this point, we will be hard pressed to get a rule in place for the 2020 election because we still need to agree on rule text and to get an E&J written. We have no meetings for a month because my colleagues were not willing to schedule any meetings for the next 4 weeks. I don't know whether that means people are going to be around or not around and able to negotiate, but I keep putting it on the agenda, and every time it goes on the agenda, nothing happens. So I don't know how much longer I'm going to be willing to keep putting this on the agenda. I'm very close to asking council to draft a notice of disposition unless I see some real commitment and progress to getting this done. I think that would be a real shame if we were not able to get this done because, as I said, hundreds of thousands of people wrote to us and said, please do this. And I really think it would be a benefit to to all of those who are, as I said, increasingly using digital platforms for their advertising to get this clarity and increased flexibility. I think it really would be good for everyone. And of course, I continue to be concerned about whether people have adequate information about about the sources of information about politics that they're getting on the internet. And this just addresses a very, very small slice of that, but it would be a real shame if we couldn't get it done. So I don't know, Mr. Vice Chairman, are we going to make any progress in August?
Well, I hope so. I'll definitely be willing to talk with you, have my staff talk with your staff, and hopefully we can get to a point where we've got an understanding that this is workable and we can do it. Or if it looks like we can't, then maybe if we reach some sort of an impasse, maybe we can get it to a flashpoint one way or another over the next few weeks. I hope that we can.
All right, well, I will keep it on the agenda, and hopefully the next thing we do will not be a notice of disposition, but progress is hard. I don't know if anybody else has any comments they want to make on this. If not, Mr. Staff Director, do we have any management or administrative matters to discuss?
Madam Chair, there are no such matters.
Thank you. In that case, this meeting is adjourned.